So, you figure you're tired of all those fantasy stories that just have monarchies, and you would like to have a democracy in your fantasy world. But you're maybe not quite sure how to set it up. Should you go with a direct democracy? What about a primitive democracy? Representative? Elites? What do all those models of democracy even mean? And how will magic or advanced technology impact a democracy? That is the topic of my video today. Models of democracy, what they offer us as fantasy world builders, and how to build them. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. This video is sponsored by World Anvil, a set of world building tools that helps you create, organize, and store your world settings. Today, we're talking about democracy as a form of government. So I checked out the World Anvil organization template, and lo and behold, they do have a subsection for Senate, Parliament type organizations. This template has some great questions, and you can link the leader of your organization to the organization in World Anvil, a feature that I really enjoyed once I started putting the characters from my book onto my World Anvil site. If you are ready to use World Anvil, you can sign up for free, and if you're ready to get rid of the ads, you can use my link for a 10% discount. Check it all out at the link below. Okay, let's get cracking. As always, just a brief PSA, I'm not a political scientist and I'm not throwing stones at any given country system. My interest in democracies are for their application to a fantasy world, not to have a political argument about which system is better. With that said, let's get into it. There are two primary models to democracy: direct and representative. So in a direct democracy, which is also sometimes called a participatory democracy, you have broad participation by the citizens, or the enfranchised citizens at least, in the decisions taken by the democracy. So this is typically where you don't have an elected government. What you have is a government that proposes legislation that the citizens then vote on. Athens had this kind of model where all male citizens voted on everything, and the bureaucracy of state just implemented the will of the citizens. In this kind of democracy, power very much belongs to the people. It's also an extension of what is sometimes called a primitive democracy, which is where you have what amounts to a tribe of people who reach a democratic decision not through voting but through consensus. So they will discuss various options in a small community and then reach a consensus-based decision. This kind of democracy has some limitations, especially in a world where you don't have ready access to technology, in terms of allowing people sufficient time to understand what it is that they're voting on and also cast their ballot. It worked well in Athens, but Athens was a city-state. If you had this spread over all of Greece and there were people making, and all of the Greek citizens were making decisions for the whole country during the classical period, you might have had some trouble getting all those votes. Switzerland does implement this model to an extent. So in Switzerland, you vote on government initiatives every 6 months. You receive your ballot, your referenda papers by mail, along with explanatory information about what you're voting on. You then vote and send your ballot back into the government, and the results decide, what is implemented as legislation. But Switzerland also implements this as a vote-by-mail system, so people can actually participate with regularity, which means that if you want to implement such a system, you need a working mail system that does not take days or months to deliver a letter. The second thing is Switzerland has strict laws protecting the citizens from misinformation in these referenda efforts. And if you provide misleading information to those voting on the referenda, you can go to jail in Switzerland. So that is also something to think about. You basically need a fairly educated citizenry at this point, and one that can consume large quantities of information and make a decision based on that information. Okay, so that's a direct democracy. What about a representative democracy? So this is the model that we are all typically familiar with. A republic is an example of this, and it is where the citizenry have a say in choosing the executive arm of the government as well as the legislative arm of the government. Rome was an example of this, the Roman Republic. The Carthage government was based on this kind of system where you elected people to office. The Gana Shangas in India had assemblies as early as the 6th century BC, although they combined it with a monarchic system. Actually, the various forms of democracy were quite popular during the Bronze and Classical period of our history. So don't feel obligated to implement a monarchy. We did have democracies. They were existent, and they are now as well, of course. A representative democracy can also include some direct elements. You can see this in things like having referendums in a representative democracy where you put large questions to your population and take their opinion into account in your decision-making process. You also can have recall of laws which you put before your population, and you can have citizen initiatives where citizens gather sufficient support to take an idea to their legislative body and say, implement this, please. So you can have a petition to say, we want the people to vote on this, and if it garners enough votes, then it will go to the legislative body who will then make it into law. Most representative democracies don't have it where these semi-direct elements become immediate law. It's more a case of like, okay, the citizenry have decided this, and now their elected representatives must take that decision and implement it in a way that takes into consideration the rest of the country's governance and the rest of the country's laws and potential impact on their external trade partners and so on. So in direct democracy, the citizens' decisions are critical to be implemented right there as stated. In a representative democracy, the citizens elect those that they feel best represent them, and those representatives form the government. And those are your two broad divisions between democracy. So if you enjoyed that discussion of the difference between representative and direct democracy, hit the thumbs up button, and let's talk about 3 detailed models of democracy. The first model I'd like to discuss is Consociationalism. I'm going to write that on the whiteboard. It's a stable democratic system in deeply divided societies that is based on power sharing between the elites from different social groups. It's essentially a government by grand coalition, or a government of national unity, as it's sometimes called. Examples of this include Czechoslovakia or even the European Union. Now, the European Union is not a government per se. We're organized by means of a treaty. Each country is still its own country with its own laws, with its own structures and standards and everything else. But the European Union provides a place where those who represent their countries can come to agreement for laws that govern all of us. So, for example, Scandinavian food standards are higher than the European Union food standards. But all of us, all of Europe, must adhere to the minimum quality of food standards as set by Brussels. And this kind of democratic system occurs when you have a society that has great divisions between them. For example, Europe's countries are very different. Italy and Finland are worlds apart on a multitude of issues. But yet we can come together under the broad banner of the European Union to legislate matters that are important to both countries. So if you have a society that has such deep divisions and are so very, very different, you might want to implement this type of democracy where you have whatever governs them internally is still there, and then elites from those societies or elected representatives of those societies come together to govern basically the cracks between them, to make it possible for these societies to work together. The second model that I wish to discuss is the classical parliamentarian system. So this is the democratic form of government I guess most of us are familiar with, in which the party or coalition of parties with the greatest representation in the parliament forms the government, and the leader of the parliament becomes the prime minister or the chancellor. Britain is set up like this. Finland is set up like this. It is an extremely common system of democratic government. The executive branch is often split away into a separate role. So in Britain, for example, you have the civil service, which is politically a fairly neutral body. And while they are governed by ministers, which change when the government changes, the civil servants continue to function in an apolitical merit-based system. In Finland, the president is elected separately from the parliament, and our president serves as an almost ambassadorial role, so he will go and meet with various foreign presidents and he will have state dinners and so on, but our prime minister runs the actual country. So quite often in parliamentary systems, you do split away the executive branch and the executive head as a more ceremonial and bureaucratic role versus the legislative role that is fulfilled by parliament. You can also in here have a monarchic head of government, the way that the constitutional monarchs of Europe do it, where you have a ceremonial head of government that is a monarchy. In your fantasy world, you could also potentially play around with having that monarch fulfill an actual useful role in the government in terms of potentially running the civil servant bureaucracy part of the government, and potentially even running kind of the ambassador service of the government. So being an external representation to the people beyond your borders while the elected government runs and while the elected government decides the laws and so on. So your executive branch, your monarchic branch, just implements everything that is decided by the legislature of the people. And then, of course, you have the presidential model of democracy, which is where the president holds executive power and you have a separate body of lawmakers. For an example of this, the United States is, of course, the big one in our current day and age, where the president is elected separately from Congress and holds enormous executive power. And the president appoints the executive bodies below him. So the secretaries of state, the ambassadors, the head of the police forces, etc. All of this falls within the remit of the presidential office. In the classical world, this is also how the Roman Republic ran. There was the Senate, which discussed laws and brought things before the assemblies and so on, but Rome was run by the consuls, who were elected separately from the senators and the assemblies of the tribes of Rome. And if you enjoyed that discussion of those three models of democracy, hit the thumbs up button. And let's talk about how you would actually implement democracy in your fantasy world. The first most important question you should ask yourself is, who is enfranchised? Now, in Athens, all males were enfranchised, but only males. So women were not enfranchised, nor were any slaves, of course. And you had to be a citizen of Athens. You could go with all citizens, as we currently have it, or all residents of a country, or you could go with even children being enfranchised. Maybe you have a certain age limit. So that is typically a limitation placed on citizenship or on your population of your country. But you could also go for some kind of elite qualification, like with the Pope, only the cardinals can vote, or maybe you need to, make enough money to buy the right to vote. So you need to pay a kind of a tax to be able to vote. Maybe in a world that has magic, only mages can vote. So only if you can pass a test of magic do you get to vote. So you've got a whole variety of options available to you. And you also need to decide at this point whether people cast their votes as individuals or whether it's kind of a group casting its votes. So, for example, in the French Parliament, the one that led to the French Revolution, the estates cast votes. Now, the estates were constructed like this. The first estate was all the clergymen of France. The second estate was all the nobles of France. The third estate was everybody else. So guess what? Because of that enfranchisement laws, the two smallest estates, the nobles and the clergy, outvoted everybody else. So literally, your enfranchisement laws were set up in such a way that you enabled minority rule. And of course, this did eventually lead to revolution, as it so often does. In that kind of a system, where your enfranchisement is not at the individual level, but at the group level, you can often end up with that kind of minority rule. So what does enfranchisement laws offer you as a fantasy world builder or a storyteller? Conflict. You can have people fighting for enfranchisement. You can have people battling against the minority rule. Or you can have people battling against a large majority for a minority's rights. You can also use this to show an society based on equality. Let's say you want to construct a country that is largely equal. One of the best ways to show this to your reader is through having a democratic system where everybody is enfranchised to vote as individuals. This shows the reader that you have an egalitarian society. Okay, so once you've decided how you want people to be enfranchised, your second question is, how do they actually vote? So if you barely have a postal system, people are going to need to travel somewhere to vote. And this automatically sets up a situation where only those who can afford to travel will be able to cast their vote. Now, you can overcome this with either science or magic. And really, science comes into its own here. You could have a direct democracy where people vote daily if you have a scientific method by which they can do this through their personal devices connected to an internet-type system. Also, the act of voting will automatically engender some kind of bureaucracy unless it's all automated. Because you're going to need people who tally the vote, people who make sure that every ballot has its legitimacy, people who communicate the ballots, people who spread the ballots and gather them. There's a whole series of bureaucracy elements around actually casting the votes. And of course, bureaucracy offers the opportunity for people interacting with that bureaucracy. It offers the richness of environment, and it offers you the ability to show your world's inner workings by having people just interact with some parts of that bureaucracy. You also need to ask yourself, do people read or write, or do they cast their ballots in some other means? In one of Catherine Kerr's cities, they have an electoral system based on pebbles that you throw into a container. And then you have a black pebble for yes and a white pebble for no, and you tally those together. This kind of system works well if you don't need your population to read, and your population is in a place where they can easily come together. The leaders can put the proposal before the population, and the population can vote there and then with their pebbles. So it is worth considering exactly how people cast their ballot and what that says about your society and what it implies about your society. It could give you a great postal system just to enable the vote. And then, of course, you do actually need a government to result from this. A democracy will have an extensive bureaucratic arm. You will probably want to separate your executive branch from your legislative branch in a democracy. You're going to need things like committees in your legislative branches. I know that when you look at our governments around the world, it seems like they're bloated governments that just seem to never make any decisions. But that is truly the nature of a democracy. You have people engaged in discussion and debate, and it takes time to reach any kind of conclusion. In your decision around your government, you probably also want to decide on things like term lengths. Rome's consuls only served for a year. In our governments, it's often 4 years or 5 years. That seems to be the set term limit. But the United States Congress, the House, only serves for 2 years. So you have a lot of scope here to play around with how long does somebody who is elected serve. You also want to decide on how much impact do citizens have. Are there any elements of direct decision making? Are there any referenda? Are there recalls? Are there citizen initiatives? And as with any government, you still need to flex. Now, in a monarchic government, you flex by means of your court and your dress, and it's the people flexing. In a democracy, what you want to do is you want to flex your institutions. You need large buildings, you need flags, and you need people, praising the democratic institutions. You need people to believe in the system, and that means that the system itself needs to have built-in flexes to advertise what it's selling. People need to believe in their government. Otherwise, it stops being a government and starts becoming a tyranny. And if you enjoyed that discussion of how to build a democracy in a fantasy world, hit the thumbs up button and maybe check out my video on Fantasy Governments 101, Legitimacy and Models. And if you want to connect around this or any other topics, I do have a Discord server linked down below. And I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time Worlds.